The small town of Maplewood was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, or at least their stories. It wasn't bustling with activity, but it had a charm that came from quiet streets lined with oak trees and cozy homes. At the heart of it all stood Tom's Diner, a modest eatery run by Tom Reynolds, a man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and a knack for making anyone feel welcome. The diner had been in Tom's family for decades, serving hearty meals to locals who appreciated its comforting vibe. On this particular evening, the diner was unusually quiet. Most customers had already left, leaving only a few stragglers finishing their dinners. One of them was Mark Johnson, a burly mechanic in his early 40s with calloused hands and a warm smile. Mark was a regular at Tom's, often stopping by after work for a hot meal before heading home. Tonight, he sat in his usual booth near the window, sipping coffee and reading a newspaper as rain drizzled outside. The diner's fluorescent lights cast a soft glow over the room, highlighting the worn Formica tables and vinyl booths that had seen better days. The faint hum of the jukebox in the corner played an old country song, adding to the relaxed atmosphere. Tom bustled behind the counter, wiping down surfaces and occasionally exchanging pleasantries with the remaining patrons. Everything seemed ordinary until the door creaked open. A man stepped inside, shaking off the rain from his tattered jacket. His name was Eddie Carter, though no one in the diner knew him personally. He looked out of place among the cozy setting. His clothes were patched and dirty, his face weathered by years of hardship. Eddie hesitated for a moment, scanning the room nervously before approaching Mark's table. "Excuse me, sir," Eddie said, his voice barely above a whisper. Can I have your leftovers?" Mark looked up from his paper, startled. He studied Eddie carefully, the hollow cheeks, the tired eyes, and nodded slowly. "Of course," he replied, pushing the plate toward him. "Help yourself." Eddie murmured a quiet thank you and retreated to a corner of the diner, where he began eating quickly, as if afraid someone might take the food away. Tom watched the exchange silently, his brow furrowed with concern. Something about Eddie's demeanor hinted at a deeper story, one that went beyond hunger or homelessness. As Mark returned to his newspaper, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Eddie than met the eye. Little did he know what happened next would change not only Eddie's life but also his own, and the entire community's. Eddie ate quickly, hunched over the plate of leftovers as if shielding it from view. His movements were deliberate but hurried, each bite swallowed almost without chewing. Mark watched him from his booth, feeling a mix of pity and curiosity. There was something about Eddie's demeanor that tugged at his heart, something beyond the obvious signs of poverty. The diner grew quieter as the last few customers left, leaving only Tom wiping down counters and the faint hum of the jukebox playing in the background. Eddie sat alone in the corner, his shoulders slumped, his focus entirely on the food in front of him. When he finally finished, he set the fork down gently, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. For a moment, he just stared at the empty plate, lost in thought. Mark decided to break the silence. "Hey!" he called softly, gesturing for Eddie to come closer. "You okay?" Eddie hesitated, then shuffled toward Mark's booth, keeping his head low. "I'm fine, sir. Thank you again for letting me. Well, you know." His voice trailed off, tinged with embarrassment. "No problem," Mark replied, offering a reassuring smile. "Happens to the best of us sometimes." Eddie nodded but didn't respond. Instead, he glanced around the diner nervously, as though expecting someone, or something, to appear. Mark noticed this and tilted his head slightly. "You got family nearby? Someone you're staying with?" Eddie stiffened, his jaw tightening. After a long pause, he shook his head. "No, sir. It's just me." Something about the way he said it made Mark uneasy. He pressed further, his tone gentle but firm. "Just you? No kids or anything?" At this, Eddie froze. His eyes darted toward the door, then back to Mark, as if weighing whether to trust him. Finally, he let out a shaky sigh. "Look, I don't want no trouble. Just trying to get by." Before Mark could respond, Eddie turned abruptly and headed toward the exit. But as he reached the door, he stopped suddenly, glancing back at Mark with an expression that was equal parts fear and desperation. Then, without another word, he disappeared into the rainy night. Mark frowned, unsettled by the encounter. Something didn't add up. Why had Eddie reacted so strongly to the mention of kids? And why did he seem so anxious? Tom approached Mark, drying his hands on a towel. "What was that all about?" he asked, nodding toward the door Eddie had just exited. "I'm not sure," Mark admitted, still staring at the spot where Eddie had stood. "But there's more going on with him than meets the eye." As they spoke, a loud clap of thunder echoed outside, shaking the windows. Mark stood up, grabbing his coat. "I'll be right back," he said to Tom. "There's something I need to check." Without waiting for a response, he stepped out into the rain. The street was deserted, save for a shadowy figure leaning against a lamppost a few yards away. It was Eddie, shivering in the cold, clutching his jacket tightly around him. As Mark approached, he noticed something else. A small pair of feet peeking out from behind Eddie's legs. "Who's that?" Mark asked, pointing toward the child hiding behind Eddie. Eddie tensed, stepping protectively in front of the boy. "It's none of your business," he snapped, though his voice wavered. Mark raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Hey, take it easy. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to help." For a long moment, Eddie said nothing. Then, reluctantly, he moved aside, revealing a young boy, no older than 5, clutching an old, threadbare blanket. The child's face was pale and gaunt, his wide eyes filled with fear. He clung to Eddie's leg, trembling silently. Mark's chest tightened as he took in the scene. This wasn't just a man struggling to survive. It was a father doing everything he could to protect his son. "What's his name?" Mark asked softly, crouching down to get closer to the boy. "Sammy," Eddie muttered, his voice barely audible over the rain. "His name's Sammy." Mark nodded, his mind racing. He glanced back at the diner, then at Eddie and Sammy. They were soaked to the bone, clearly exhausted, and in desperate need of help. Whatever their story was, one thing was clear. They couldn't keep living like this. "We should get you two inside," Mark said firmly, standing up. "Come on, let's talk about what we can do to help." Eddie hesitated, torn between pride and desperation. Finally, after a long pause, he nodded. Taking Sammy's hand, he followed Mark back into the warmth of the diner, where Tom waited with a pot of hot coffee and a stack of clean towels. Back inside the diner, Tom quickly sprang into action. He grabbed a couple of clean towels and handed them to Eddie and Sammy, who were both drenched from the rain. The boy clung tightly to his father's leg, his wide eyes darting around the room as if searching for danger. Eddie wrapped the towel around Sammy's shoulders, whispering softly to him in an attempt to calm his nerves. Mark crouched down to Sammy's level, offering a warm smile. "Hey there, buddy. My name's Mark. What do you say we get you warmed up?" "Huh." Sammy didn't respond, burying his face further into Eddie's side. Eddie placed a protective hand on the boy's head, his expression guarded but tinged with sadness. "He doesn't talk much," Eddie explained quietly. "Not since, well, it's been hard." Tom brought over 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate, setting them on the table. "Here," he said gently, "for both of you. Go ahead. Take it slow." Eddie hesitated before reaching for one of the mugs, handing it carefully to Sammy. The boy peeked out cautiously, his tiny hands gripping the mug as he took a tentative sip. A flicker of relief crossed Eddie's face as he watched his son drink, though his own exhaustion was evident in the way he slumped forward slightly. Mark sat across from them, studying their interaction. "How long have you two been out here?" he asked softly, careful not to sound accusatory. Eddie sighed, rubbing a hand over his stubbled face. "Too long," he admitted. "It started with me losing my job after I got hurt. Couldn't keep up with rent, bills. Everything fell apart. We've been moving from place to place ever since." "And no one knows you're out here?" Tom chimed in, his voice laced with disbelief. "Family? Friends?" "No family left," Eddie replied, shaking his head. "And friends. They stopped calling once things got bad." Guess people don't know what to do when someone hits rock bottom. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Mark exchanged a glance with Tom, both men silently acknowledging the enormity of Eddie's situation. It wasn't just about food or shelter. It was about survival, dignity, and keeping a child safe in the face of unimaginable hardship. As Sammy continued drinking his hot chocolate, Mark noticed how frail the boy looked. His cheeks were sunken, his arms impossibly thin beneath the oversized sweater he wore. Every movement seemed deliberate, as though conserving energy was second nature to him. Mark felt a pang of anger. Not at Eddie, but at the circumstances that had reduced this family to living on the streets. "Does Sammy go to school?" Mark asked, trying to keep his tone light. Eddie shook his head. "Can't risk it. Too many questions. People notice things. They'd start asking why we don't have a home, where his mom is." His voice cracked slightly, and he paused to compose himself. "We try to stay hidden. Safer that way." Mark nodded slowly, piecing together the fragments of their story. He glanced at Tom, who looked equally troubled. Neither of them could fathom the kind of fear and desperation that came with hiding your child from the world simply to protect him. After a few minutes, Sammy finally lifted his head, meeting Mark's gaze for the first time. The boy's eyes were filled with a mixture of curiosity and caution, as if weighing whether to trust this stranger. Mark smiled again, pulling a small toy car from his pocket, a keepsake he'd picked up earlier for his nephew. "Here," he said, placing it on the table. "I think this might be more fun than hot chocolate." Sammy hesitated, glancing up at Eddie for permission. When Eddie gave a slight nod, the boy reached out tentatively, picking up the toy. For the first time since entering the diner, a faint smile tugged at the corners of Sammy's lips. He turned the car over in his hands, inspecting it closely before rolling it across the table. "That's a good choice," Mark said encouragingly. "That's one of my favorites." Eddie watched the exchange with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to do any of this." "Yes, I did," Mark replied firmly. "Nobody should have to live like this. Not you, and especially not Sammy." Tom stepped forward, clearing his throat. "There are people who can help, Eddie. Social workers, shelters, programs for families in need. You shouldn't have to carry all this alone." Eddie's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might refuse the offer. But then he looked down at Sammy, who was now giggling softly as he played with the toy car, and something in his resolve softened. "What would happen to us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "If we went to one of those places?" "They'll make sure you're safe," Tom assured him. "They'll find you temporary housing, food, medical care for Sammy. Maybe even help you get back on your feet." Eddie nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, let's try." Mark immediately pulled out his phone, dialing a number he knew by heart. "Linda Harper," he said into the receiver. "She's a social worker. She'll know exactly what to do." As Mark spoke to Linda, Tom kept Eddie and Sammy company, bringing them plates of warm soup and sandwiches. Sammy ate eagerly, while Eddie picked at his food, too overwhelmed to focus on anything other than the enormity of the decision he'd just made. By the time Linda arrived, an hour later, armed with blankets, snacks, and a gentle demeanor, the mood in the diner had shifted. There was still tension, yes, but also a glimmer of hope. As she knelt beside Sammy, introducing herself with a soft smile, it became clear that help had finally arrived. When Linda Harper walked into the diner, her presence immediately brought a sense of calm. A seasoned social worker in her mid-50s, Linda had seen countless cases like this before, but she approached each one with the same level of care and compassion. Her warm smile and soothing voice put Eddie and Sammy at ease almost instantly. "Hi there," Linda said gently, kneeling down to Sammy's eye level. "My name's Linda. I hear you're pretty good at playing with cars." She gestured toward the toy car still clutched in Sammy's hands, eliciting a shy nod from the boy. Eddie watched nervously as Linda turned her attention to him. "Mr. Carter, is it?" Mark filled me in on some details, but I'd love to hear your story directly from you, if you're comfortable sharing. Eddie hesitated, glancing at Sammy, who was now distracted by the toy car. Finally, he nodded. Yeah, okay. But can we maybe talk somewhere quieter? Linda agreed, and Tom offered them use of the diner's storage room, a small, private space where they could speak without interruptions. As they settled in, Linda pulled out a notepad and began asking questions about their situation. How long they'd been homeless, what resources they'd accessed so far, and whether Sammy had any medical needs. Eddie answered honestly, his voice trembling at times. He explained that Sammy hadn't seen a doctor in over a year due to lack of insurance and fear of drawing attention. He also revealed that Sammy's mother, his late wife, had passed away 2 years ago after a brief illness, leaving him to raise their son alone. The loss had devastated him, making it harder to hold down a job or find stability. As Eddie spoke, Linda listened intently, jotting down notes while offering words of reassurance. You've done an incredible job keeping Sammy safe under such difficult circumstances, she told him. But you don't have to do this alone anymore. There are programs designed specifically to support families like yours. She outlined a plan: temporary housing at a local shelter equipped to handle families, access to food assistance programs, and enrollment in a nearby daycare center for Sammy. For Eddie, she suggested applying for disability benefits due to his injury and exploring job training opportunities through a nonprofit organization that helped individuals re-enter the workforce. By the end of the conversation, Eddie looked both overwhelmed and hopeful. I don't even know where to start, he admitted, running a hand through his damp hair. You don't have to figure it all out tonight, Linda assured him. We'll take it step by step. First, let's get you and Sammy settled somewhere safe and dry. Meanwhile, back in the main dining area, word of Eddie and Sammy's situation spread quietly among the few remaining patrons. One customer, an elderly woman named Margaret, approached Tom with tears in her eyes. That poor little boy, she whispered. Is there anything we can do to help? Tom nodded, explaining that Linda was already coordinating efforts to assist the family. Margaret insisted on contributing, pulling a $20 bill from her wallet and urging Tom to add it to whatever collection might be started. Others followed suit, dropping cash into a jar Tom placed on the counter labeled Eddie and Sammy's Fund. Mark stayed close throughout the evening, ensuring Eddie and Sammy felt supported. When Linda announced that transportation to the shelter was arranged, Mark offered to drive them personally. It's no trouble, he insisted when Eddie tried to decline. Besides, I want to make sure you guys get there safely. The ride to the shelter was quiet, with Sammy falling asleep against Eddie's shoulder. As they pulled up to the modest building, a converted church with a welcoming sign reading Hope House, Eddie took a deep breath. Thank you, he said to Mark, his voice choked with emotion. For everything. No thanks needed, Mark replied, patting Eddie's shoulder. Just focus on getting back on your feet. We're rooting for you. Inside the shelter, staff greeted them warmly, showing Eddie and Sammy to a clean, private room stocked with fresh linens and toiletries. Linda stayed behind to finalize paperwork and ensure they were fully settled. Before leaving, she handed Eddie a list of follow-up appointments and contact information, promising to check in regularly. Back at the diner, Tom and Mark reflected on the night's events. It's funny, Tom mused, wiping down the last table. Sometimes it feels like the world's falling apart. Then something like this happens, and you realize there's still good in people. Mark nodded, glancing at the jar now brimming with donations. Yeah, and sometimes all it takes is one person reaching out to remind us we're not alone. Over the next few weeks, Eddie Carter and his son Sammy began to settle into their new life at the shelter. Though far from perfect, the environment offered stability they hadn't known in years. The staff at Hope House worked tirelessly to ensure families felt supported, providing meals, counseling services, and access to resources aimed at helping them rebuild their lives. For Eddie, the transition wasn't easy. Every day brought reminders of how much he'd lost. The home he once owned, the career that defined him, the wife whose absence still ached deeply, but it also introduced glimmers of hope. He attended mandatory therapy sessions, where he opened up about the guilt and grief that had consumed him since his wife's passing. Slowly, he began to confront the emotional toll of raising Sammy alone while battling poverty and injury. During one session, Eddie recounted the moment his life unraveled. "I used to work construction," he explained, his voice heavy with regret. "Good money, steady hours. Then I fell off scaffolding during a job. Broke my leg, tore ligaments, couldn't go back to work. Workers' comp ran out, rent piled up, and before I knew it, we were evicted. I tried finding odd jobs, but no one wants to hire a guy who limps and can't lift heavy stuff." His therapist nodded sympathetically. "It sounds like you've been carrying an enormous weight all by yourself, but you're here now taking steps toward change. That's something to be proud of." Meanwhile, Sammy started attending daycare through a program recommended by Linda. At first, he was withdrawn, clinging to Eddie during drop-offs and avoiding other children. But as days turned into weeks, he began to open up. Teachers noted his curiosity and creativity, especially when given art supplies or building blocks. One afternoon, Mark visited the shelter and found Sammy proudly showing off a drawing. A bright sun shining over stick figures holding hands. "That's amazing, buddy," Mark exclaimed, crouching down to admire the picture. "Who are these people?" Sammy pointed to each figure. "That's Daddy and that's me. And this is you." He grinned shyly, pointing to a taller figure standing beside them. Mark's heart swelled. "Wow, thanks for including me. You're really talented, Sammy." Eddie watched the exchange from across the room, his lips curving into a rare smile. It was moments like these, small yet profound, that reminded him why he kept fighting. For every setback, there was progress. Sammy laughing again, eating regular meals and slowly regaining trust in others. As Eddie grew more comfortable opening up, Mark became a regular presence in their lives. He visited the shelter often, bringing groceries, toys, or simply stopping by to chat. During one visit, Eddie shared more about his late wife, Sarah, and the life they'd built together before tragedy struck. "She was everything to me," Eddie said softly, staring at an old photo of Sarah cradling baby Sammy. "She made our house feel like a home. After she passed, I didn't know how to keep going. All I cared about was keeping Sammy safe, even if it meant hiding from the world." Mark listened quietly, sensing the depth of Eddie's pain. "You're doing great, Eddie. Sarah would be proud of you for sticking it out, for loving Sammy so fiercely. And look at him now. He's starting to thrive because of you." Eddie nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I just wish she could see him now. She always said Sammy would grow up to do big things." The community continued rallying around Eddie and Sammy, inspired by their resilience. Margaret, the elderly woman who donated money at Tom's Diner, organized a clothing drive, collecting warm clothes and shoes for both father and son. Other townsfolk contributed food, books, and toys, creating a sense of camaraderie that extended beyond the shelter walls. Linda played a pivotal role in connecting Eddie with long-term solutions. She helped him apply for disability benefits, which provided financial relief while he focused on recovery. Additionally, she enrolled him in a vocational training program offered by a local nonprofit. The course taught basic carpentry skills, allowing Eddie to pursue work less physically demanding than construction. "Turns out, I'm pretty good at fixing things," Eddie joked during one of his check-ins with Linda. "Maybe I'll start my own handyman business someday." "That's fantastic," Linda replied, smiling. "Take it one step at a time, Eddie. You're already proving how capable you are." By the end of the month, Eddie and Sammy moved into transitional housing, a small apartment subsidized by the government. Though modest, it marked a significant milestone in their journey. On moving day, Mark showed up with a truckload of donated furniture, including a sturdy bed for Sammy and a cozy armchair for Eddie. "This feels surreal," Eddie admitted as they unpacked boxes. "Like maybe, just maybe, we're finally catching a break." "You deserve it," Mark said firmly. "And remember, you've got a whole town cheering you on." As Sammy explored his new room, giggling as he jumped onto his mattress, Eddie stood in the doorway watching him. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe in a brighter future. not just for Sammy, but for himself too. The support Eddie and Sammy received from the community didn't stop at temporary shelter or donations. It grew into a sustained effort to help them rebuild their lives fully. As news of their story spread, more people stepped forward, eager to contribute in meaningful ways. What started as acts of kindness soon transformed into a movement that brought the town closer together. One of the most significant developments came when Tom Reynolds, inspired by Mark's involvement, decided to host a fundraiser at his diner. He called it Hope for Hope House, dedicating an entire weekend to raising money for families like Eddie and Sammy. Flyers went up around town, and local businesses pitched in, donating food, raffle prizes, and even entertainment. On the day of the event, the diner was packed with customers, some regulars, others newcomers, all united by a shared desire to make a difference. Mark took the stage briefly to speak about Eddie and Sammy's journey. When I first met Eddie, I saw a man who'd been beaten down by life but refused to give up on his son, he said, his voice steady yet emotional. He reminded me that everyone deserves a second chance, and that sometimes, all it takes is one act of kindness to change someone's life. The crowd erupted in applause, many nodding in agreement. By the end of the weekend, the fundraiser had raised over $10,000, enough to cover several months' rent for multiple families at Hope House and provide additional resources for job training programs. Meanwhile, Eddie continued making strides in his own life. His carpentry classes proved to be a turning point, reigniting a passion for working with his hands that he hadn't felt since his construction days. Under the guidance of skilled instructors, he learned how to craft furniture and repair household items, skills he could use to start earning income again. His instructor, Mr. Peterson, noticed Eddie's dedication and offered him part-time work at a local workshop once the course ended. "You've got real talent, Eddie," Mr. Peterson told him during their final session. "And we could always use someone reliable around here." Eddie accepted the offer gratefully, knowing it was a stepping stone toward financial independence. For the first time in years, he left the house each morning with purpose, returning home to Sammy with stories about his day and plans for the future. Sammy, too, flourished in his new environment. The daycare program introduced him to other children his age, helping him overcome the isolation he'd experienced while living on the streets. Teachers marveled at his progress, noting how quickly he adapted to routines and formed friendships. One evening, as Eddie tucked him into bed, Sammy proudly announced, "I made a friend today, Daddy. Her name is Lily, and she likes cars just like me." Eddie smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Sammy's forehead. "That's wonderful, buddy. Maybe you can show her your drawings tomorrow." As weeks turned into months, Eddie and Sammy's bond deepened further. They spent weekends exploring the town, visiting parks, and attending community events organized to support families in need. At one such event, a holiday festival hosted by the local church, Sammy participated in a cookie decorating contest, winning third place with a gingerbread house he decorated himself. Eddie beamed with pride as Sammy held up his ribbon, shouting, "Look, Daddy, we did it." The sense of belonging extended beyond Eddie and Sammy. Other residents of Hope House began forming connections with townspeople, creating a network of mutual support. Margaret became a mentor to single mothers, offering advice and babysitting services so they could attend job interviews or training sessions. Tom's Diner became a hub for volunteers, who gathered weekly to organize drives or brainstorm ideas for helping struggling families. Even Mark found himself changed by the experience. Once content to focus solely on his mechanic shop, he now devoted evenings and weekends to volunteering with Linda's outreach program. He helped renovate apartments for transitional housing, fixed broken appliances at the shelter, and mentored men like Eddie who were re-entering the workforce. "It's funny," Mark told Tom one afternoon over coffee. "I thought I was helping Eddie and Sammy, but really, they've helped me. They reminded me what truly matters: family, community, and never giving up." By spring, Eddie and Sammy moved out of transitional housing and into their own small apartment, thanks to a housing assistance program. Though modestly furnished, it was theirs, a space where they could create memories without fear of losing everything again. On moving day, Friends from the shelter and members of the community showed up to celebrate, bringing homemade dishes and gifts to welcome them to their new home. Standing in the doorway of the apartment, Eddie looked around at the faces of those who had supported him. Tears welled in his eyes as he spoke. "I don't know how to thank you all," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just give us a roof over our heads. You gave us hope. And because of that, we're going to keep moving forward." As the sun set over Maplewood that evening, casting golden light over the quiet streets, Eddie sat on the porch swing with Sammy curled up beside him. Together, they watched the world go by, finally feeling safe and loved. Months passed, and life in Maplewood settled into a rhythm of quiet progress for Eddie and Sammy. Their apartment, though small, became a sanctuary filled with laughter, warmth, and the promise of stability. Eddie continued working at the carpentry workshop, honing his skills and taking pride in every piece he crafted. His growing confidence wasn't just evident in his work. It spilled over into how he interacted with others, carrying himself with a newfound sense of purpose. Sammy thrived as well. Enrolled in kindergarten now, he eagerly embraced school life, making friends and bringing home colorful drawings nearly every day. One evening, as Eddie flipped through a stack of these creations taped to the fridge, he paused at one particular picture. A bright yellow house surrounded by stick figure people holding hands. At the bottom, Sammy had scrawled in crayon, "Our happy home." Eddie chuckled softly, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He called Sammy over from the living room, where the boy was playing with his toy cars. "Hey, buddy," Eddie said, pointing to the drawing. "What's this?" "That's us," Sammy exclaimed proudly. "See? That's you, and that's me, and those are our friends. We're all happy together." Eddie pulled Sammy onto his lap, hugging him tightly. "You're right, kiddo. We are happy, and we've got a lot of good people to thank for that." Indeed, the community's impact on their lives remained profound. Margaret often stopped by with homemade meals or books for Sammy, her visits always accompanied by stories of her own grandchildren. Tom invited them to weekly dinners at the diner, ensuring they never felt disconnected from the town that had rallied around them. Even Mark stayed involved, teaching Eddie how to fix basic appliances so he could save money on repairs, a skill Eddie jokingly referred to as MacGyver 101. One crisp autumn afternoon, Eddie received an invitation to speak at a local charity event organized by Linda. Hesitant at first, he agreed after much encouragement from Mark and Sammy. Standing before a room full of strangers, Eddie recounted his journey, from the rain-soaked night at the diner to the present moment, where he stood as proof that kindness and perseverance could overcome even the darkest times. "I used to think I'd failed Sammy," Eddie admitted, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But then I realized something important. Failure isn't falling down, it's staying down. Thanks to the incredible people in this town, I found the strength to get back up. And because of them, Sammy has a chance at the future he deserves." The audience erupted in applause, many wiping away tears. Afterward, several attendees approached Eddie to shake his hand or share their own struggles, inspired by his resilience. It was a reminder that his story wasn't just about survival. It was about hope, connection, and the ripple effect of compassion. For Mark, reflecting on the past year brought its own revelations. Helping Eddie and Sammy had reignited his passion for giving back, leading him to take on leadership roles within the outreach program. He began mentoring other volunteers, sharing lessons he'd learned along the way. "It's not about fixing everything," he told newcomers during training sessions. "Sometimes, it's just about showing up, even if you don't have all the answers." As winter approached, the town held its annual Thanksgiving celebration at the community center. Families gathered to share meals, swap stories, and express gratitude. Eddie and Sammy sat at a long table alongside Margaret, Tom, Mark, and countless others who had touched their lives. When asked what he was thankful for, Sammy didn't hesitate. "I'm thankful for my daddy," he said loudly, earning smiles from everyone nearby. "And for cookies," Eddie laughed, ruffling Sammy's hair. "Me too, buddy. Me too." Later that evening, as snow began to dust the ground outside, Eddie tucked Sammy into bed. The boy drifted off quickly, clutching his favorite stuffed bear, a gift from Margaret. Eddie lingered in the doorway, watching the rise and fall of Sammy's chest, marveling at how far they'd come. He thought about Sarah, imagining her smiling down on them. "We made it, sweetheart," he whispered into the quiet room. "Not without help, but we made it." In the months and years to come, Eddie and Sammy would face challenges, as all families do, but they faced them knowing they weren't alone. The bonds forged during their hardest days became a foundation of love and support that carried them forward. Maplewood, too, was forever changed. What began as an act of kindness toward one struggling family blossomed into a culture of compassion that rippled throughout the town. Neighbors looked out for one another more closely, businesses partnered with shelters, and conversations about homelessness shifted from judgment to understanding. As the lights dimmed across Maplewood that night, Eddie stepped onto the porch, gazing at the stars above. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace. Life hadn't been easy, but it had taught him something invaluable. That even in the darkest moments, there is light, and sometimes, all it takes is reaching out to find it.